Picture this. It's around 40,000 years ago, somewhere in ancient Central Europe, and a small group is doing what ancient groups did most evenings, eating, talking in whatever sophisticated language they'd developed by that point, and generally processing the events of a difficult day. Nobody in that group has any concept of microbiology. Nobody has any framework for understanding that certain illnesses can be transmitted through intimate contact. Nobody is reading public health literature or sitting through any educational presentation about responsible behavior. And yet, somewhere in the accumulated practical wisdom of this group, transmitted across generations through exactly the evening fire storytelling culture we've discussed throughout this series, there is almost certainly some version of the awareness that certain people who were sick in certain ways seemed to make other people sick in similar ways, that patterns existed even if the mechanism was completely invisible and completely incomprehensible. They had no idea why, but the pattern was there, stubbornly present in the observable world regardless of whether anyone understood it, because nature is not particularly interested in whether its patterns are understood before it operates them. Meanwhile, completely unaware of the parallel human drama happening nearby, a pair of European bison are engaged in courtship behavior that, if you described it clinically to a room full of microbiologists, would prompt at least one of them to make a specific note in the margin of their notebook about transmission vectors. So here's what this video is actually investigating, because the title earns its curiosity. Can animals really get sexually transmitted diseases like us? And what does the surprisingly rich, surprisingly ancient, and surprisingly consequential answer tell us about ancient humans, disease history, and the genuinely fascinating ways that pathogens have been shaping animal and human behavior for an almost incomprehensible stretch of time? Stick around, because this goes considerably further and in considerably more interesting directions than the headline implies, and the ancient human story sitting at the center of it changes how you think about disease, behavior, and the biological world we actually inhabit. Start with the basic biology, because the mechanism matters for understanding everything else. A sexually transmitted infection is, stripped to its essentials, a pathogen that has evolved transmission strategies optimized around the specific circumstances of sexual contact between hosts, using the particular combination of mucous membrane proximity, fluid exchange, and behavioral predictability that sexual behavior provides to move between hosts more efficiently than it could through other transmission routes. From the pathogen's perspective, sexual behavior is simply a reliable ecological opportunity, a predictable host-to-host contact event that happens with sufficient frequency to make specialization toward it worthwhile from an evolutionary standpoint. This logic applies entirely independently of whether the hosts are human. Any species that engages in sexual behavior involving close physical contact and fluid exchange provides the same basic ecological opportunity for pathogen specialization. The specific pathogens that exploit this opportunity differ between species, shaped by the specific biology of each host and each pathogen, but the underlying evolutionary dynamic that produces sexually transmitted pathogens is universal across sexually reproducing species. There is nothing specifically human about the biological conditions that create sexually transmitted infections. We simply happen to be one of many species that provides the relevant ecological opportunity. The animal kingdom contains an extensive array of species-specific sexually transmitted pathogens that most people have never heard of, because the educational conversation about sexually transmitted infections focuses almost exclusively on human cases. Brucellosis affects numerous mammal species, including cattle, dogs, and various wild ungulates, with significant transmission occurring through sexual contact and reproductive activity. Bovine herpes virus causes reproductive infections in cattle with transmission dynamics that parallel aspects of herpes virus transmission in humans quite closely at the mechanistic level. Mycoplasmosis causes reproductive tract infections in various bird species, with transmission occurring during mating contact. Canine transmissible venereal tumor is perhaps the most remarkable example in the entire animal kingdom, a parasitic cancer that transmits directly between dogs through sexual contact, persisting as a transmissible cell line for what researchers estimate has been thousands of years. That last one deserves specific attention because it's genuinely remarkable. Canine transmissible venereal tumor is not caused by a virus or bacterium, but by actual cancer cells that have survived as a transmissible parasite, passed directly between individual dogs during mating contact, maintaining themselves as a continuous cell line across millennia. The original tumor cells from which all current cases descended lived in a dog that died thousands of years ago, and yet genetically those same cells continue circulating through dog populations worldwide. This is one of only a small number of known transmissible cancers in the animal kingdom, and its transmission mechanism, sexual contact between dogs, makes it functionally a sexually transmitted disease at the epidemiological level, even though its underlying biology is different from any bacterial or viral pathogen. Koalas have become one of the most widely discussed examples of animal sexually transmitted disease in recent years because of the devastating impact chlamydia has had on koala populations, causing blindness, infertility, and significant mortality across affected populations. Koala chlamydia, caused by Chlamydia pecorum and Chlamydia pneumonia strains, spreads through sexual contact and from mother to offspring, creating a transmission network that mirrors in some ways the transmission dynamics of chlamydial infections in humans, though caused by related but distinct bacterial strains. The impact on koala reproductive success has been severe enough to make it a significant conservation concern, demonstrating that the consequences of sexually transmitted pathogens for animal populations can be as consequential as their effects on human populations. Rabbits provided one of the most extensively studied examples of sexually transmitted disease dynamics in animal populations when myxomatosis was introduced into Australian rabbit populations in the mid-20th century as a population control measure. While myxomatosis has multiple transmission routes, including insect vectors, it transmits efficiently through sexual contact, and studying its spread through rabbit populations provided important data on how sexually transmitted pathogens propagate through host populations with specific mating behaviors and social structures. The trajectory of myxomatosis through rabbit populations, with initial high mortality followed by gradual evolution of both increased host resistance and reduced pathogen virulence, illustrates general principles of host-pathogen co-evolution that apply broadly across sexually transmitted pathogens in any species. The connection to ancient humans becomes clearer and considerably more interesting when you consider the specific disease history of our own species and what the evidence suggests about where many human pathogens originated. Various human pathogens appear to have crossed from animal populations into human populations during the ancient era, with the specific circumstances of ancient human contact with animal species providing the transmission opportunities that initial cross-species infection required. The zoonotic origin of many human diseases, including several with sexual or intimate contact transmission components, connects the animal's sexually transmitted disease story directly to the ancient human experience of emerging infectious disease. Consider herpes simplex viruses, which have an extensive evolutionary history across primate lineages. HSV2, which causes genital herpes in humans, appears to have crossed into human ancestors from ancestors of modern chimpanzees in Africa at some point in the deep ancient past, with subsequent genetic divergence producing the human-specific strains that circulate in modern human populations. This cross-species transmission almost certainly didn't happen through direct sexual contact between ancient humans and chimpanzees, but rather through other forms of close contact, possibly blood exposure during hunting or butchery of primates, with the virus then establishing itself in human populations and eventually adapting toward more efficient human-to-human transmission routes, including sexual transmission. HSV1, which causes oral herpes, appears to have been with our lineage considerably longer, predating the human-chimpanzee divergence, suggesting that our direct ancestors were already carrying this pathogen before the evolutionary split that produced separate human and chimpanzee lineages. This remarkable evolutionary depth means that ancient humans throughout the entire period this channel covers were likely already carrying herpes virus infections, experiencing them as a normal background feature of life that they had no way of understanding or contextualizing within any germ theory framework. But that was nonetheless shaping health outcomes, immune development, and potentially behavior in ways that were real, even without anyone understanding them. The ancient human experience of sexually transmitted disease would have been entirely experiential rather than conceptual. No ancient human understood what a virus or bacterium was. No ancient human had any framework for the concept of sexual transmission as a specific epidemiological route distinct from other transmission mechanisms. What ancient humans had was observable patterns. People who had certain visible symptoms seemed to give those symptoms to people they were intimate with. Certain groups of people seemed to have higher rates of certain conditions, certain behaviors seemed to be associated with certain health outcomes, without any causal framework connecting the observations. The transmission of this observational knowledge through oral culture, The same evening fire storytelling and knowledge transmission mechanism we've discussed throughout this series in contexts ranging from food safety to plant medicine to animal behavior would have produced practical behavioral knowledge without mechanistic understanding. Certain behaviors producing certain bad health outcomes would have been incorporated into cultural memory as practical warnings without anyone understanding why those warnings were accurate. This is the same pattern we discussed in our food safety video regarding toxic plants, where accurate practical knowledge preceded mechanistic understanding by thousands of years, with knowledge being encoded in stories, taboos, and cultural practices that preserved the practical truth without requiring the underlying explanation. The ancient human-animal disease relationship extends well beyond simple cross-species pathogen transmission into something more complex and more consequential. Ancient humans living in close proximity to various animal species, proto-dogs in camp perimeters, the animals they regularly hunted and butchered, the species they shared water sources with, were embedded in a pathogen ecology that moved constantly between human and animal populations in both directions. Ancient humans carried pathogens that infected their animal companions, and those companions carried pathogens that infected ancient humans, with the shared ecological space of camp and hunting territory functioning as a continuous zone of interspecies microbial exchange. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. This bidirectional pathogen exchange has left traces in modern disease patterns that researchers studying evolutionary epidemiology continue to work through. Various human pathogens show evolutionary signatures of having recently crossed from animal hosts, with genetic divergence analyses suggesting the timing of these crossings in ways that sometimes map onto specific ancient human ecological transitions. The deepening human-dog relationship during the proto-domestication period, for instance, almost certainly involved significant exchange of pathogens between human and proto-dog populations, with both populations acquiring new pathogens from the other, while also developing immune responses and resistance to those new challenges across the generations of close contact. Something worth examining directly is the behavioral component of sexually transmitted disease in animals beyond simple mechanics of transmission. Various researchers studying the behavioral ecology of sexually transmitted pathogens have found that these infections can influence host behavior in ways that affect their own transmission success, creating complex feedback loops between pathogen biology and host behavioral ecology. In some species, infected individuals show altered mate choice behavior, altered mating frequency, or altered competitive behavior with these changes, sometimes serving the pathogen's transmission interests even at cost to the host's fitness. Whether similar behavioral influences of pathogens on host behavior occurred in ancient humans is difficult to assess directly, but the general principle that pathogens can influence host behavior, established across multiple animal species in controlled research contexts, means it's worth considering that some aspects of ancient human behavioral patterns around reproduction and intimacy may have been shaped by pathogen effects that ancient humans had no ability to recognize or understand. The influence of pathogens on behavior is an area of active research that continues to produce surprising results, and the ancient human context provides relevant background for understanding the evolutionary timescale over which these influences would have been operating. The immune system dimension of this story deserves attention because the co-evolutionary history between humans and their pathogens, including those with sexual transmission routes, has left specific signatures in human immune system genetics that modern genomic research has been progressively mapping. Various immune system genes show patterns of evolutionary selection that researchers interpret as evidence of historical pathogen pressure, with the specific genetic variants that spread through ancient human populations providing clues about which pathogens those populations were facing and when. The distribution of these immune-related genetic variants across modern human populations reflects the specific pathogen histories of different ancient human groups, with populations that spent many generations in contact with specific pathogens showing immune adaptations that populations without that history don't show. This immune genetics evidence provides another indirect window into the ancient human disease experience, supplementing the more direct but fragmentary evidence from archaeological contexts. An ancient population carrying immune genetic variants specifically adapted to particular pathogen types was in some sense, recording that pathogen encounter in its genome, creating a biological archive that modern researchers can read to reconstruct aspects of ancient disease history that left no other recoverable evidence. The sexually transmitted disease history of ancient humans, invisible at the level of individual archaeological remains in most cases, is partially recoverable through this genomic archive. Returning to the animal kingdom, the full scope of documented sexually transmitted pathogens across species is extensive enough to suggest that sexual transmission is an evolutionarily convergent strategy that has developed independently many times across many different pathogen lineages facing the same basic ecological opportunity. The predictability, intimacy, and fluid exchange characteristics of sexual behavior in virtually any reproducing species with the relevant anatomy provide a transmission route that pathogens with the right biological toolkit can exploit, and evolution has produced that toolkit independently in bacteria, viruses, fungi, and parasites across many different host lineages. This convergent evolution of sexual transmission strategies across independent pathogen lineages means that the animal's sexually transmitted disease landscape is considerably richer and more diverse than most people realize, with species-specific pathogens exploiting sexual transmission routes across essentially every major vertebrate group and many invertebrate groups as well. Fish, reptiles, birds, and mammals all have documented cases of pathogens with significant sexual transmission components, and marine invertebrates, including certain bivalve species, have documented transmissible cell lines that spread through close contact during spawning events, representing something analogous to the canine transmissible venereal tumor at a different phylogenetic level. The ancient human story intersects with all of this in one more specific and particularly consequential way: the megafauna hunting and processing activities that occupied a major portion of ancient human practical life brought ancient humans into direct, intimate biological contact with the blood, tissues, and body fluids of many large animal species, creating transmission opportunities for animal pathogens to encounter human biological substrates. Ancient hunters butchering a mammoth carcass, working with their hands deep in an animal that carried its own community of resident microorganisms, were engaged in an activity that created pathogen exposure opportunities of a kind that most modern humans never encounter. The majority of these exposures would have produced no disease, because most animal pathogens are poorly adapted to human hosts and cause no infection when they encounter them. But across the many thousands of such exposures over many generations of ancient hunting activity, occasional successful cross-species infections would occur, producing new human infections with animal origin pathogens that then either died out when the infected individual died, or, far more rarely and far more consequentially, established themselves in the human population by developing the capacity for efficient human-to-human transmission. The entire history of emerging infectious diseases, still playing out in modern times with each new animal origin human pathogen, is simply a continuation of the same process that ancient hunters were participating in every time they processed an animal carcass. The connection between ancient hunting and disease emergence is not hypothetical. Researchers studying the origins of many significant human pathogens have traced their evolutionary origins to animal host populations, with estimated timing of cross-species transmission events sometimes mapping onto periods of intensified ancient human-animal contact. This doesn't mean ancient hunters were doing anything wrong or that their activities were dangerous in a way that should have been avoided. It means they were participating in the ancient ecological reality of being a large, mobile, ecologically active species in intimate contact with many other species, a reality that includes pathogen exchange as a normal component of the ecological relationship, not an exception to it. What ancient humans had that mitigated some of this pathogen exposure risk was exactly the accumulated practical knowledge and behavioral flexibility we've documented throughout this series. The cultural practices around food preparation, the fire use that reduced pathogen viability in cooked food, the accumulated knowledge about which animals and which situations seemed to produce certain bad health outcomes, all of these represented a practical public health infrastructure operating without any theoretical foundation, but producing real, observable effects on health outcomes through behavioral modification based on observed patterns rather than understood mechanisms. The specific question of whether animals get sexually transmitted diseases like us has then a layered answer. Yes, across all the dimensions that matter biologically and epidemiologically, essentially every sexually reproducing species with appropriate anatomy and behavior provides the ecological opportunity for sexually transmitted pathogens, and many species have their own sexually transmitted pathogens exploiting those opportunities. The specific pathogens differ between species, shaped by host-specific biology and evolutionary history, but the underlying dynamic is universal. Some of the most consequential pathogens in human history appear to have originated in animal populations before crossing into humans and adapting toward human-to-human transmission. And the ancient humans who were most intimately exposed to this cross-species pathogen ecology were doing so without any conceptual framework for understanding it, navigating it entirely through accumulated practical behavioral knowledge that preserved useful patterns without explanations. The ancient woman examining a sick animal with the experienced eye of someone who'd learned which animals to avoid eating and which ones seemed to make the people who ate them sick was doing epidemiology without the word, the concept, or the theory. She was just doing what ancient humans always did, paying close attention to patterns in a world that didn't come with explanations, and doing something useful with what the patterns showed.